I know you've spoken in the past couple of weeks to about 100 or more of these victims. What have they told you about what they've lost?
Yeah, hey, Tim. Hey, Isabelle. Thanks for having me back. Very tough conversations with these folks. These are people that did everything right? They didn't accidentally lose their keys. They weren't, trading deep down the risk curve in DeFi, chasing yield. They were saving their money in Bitcoin, sending it to their cold storage where they thought it was safe, and it turned out not to be. I've heard terrible stories, Tim, people losing their life savings, people who couldn't get back to their device to rescue the funds because they were camping or their wife was in labor. All manner of the saddest stories you could think of, Tim.
So in your conversations, Alex, do you think that we're anywhere close to knowing the true scale of losses, or do you think we're still in the early stages?
I think we're close to knowing the true scale of losses, the acceleration in identifying lost victim funds, stolen victim funds. The growth has slowed, right? So I do estimate that it'll be over 130 million when all is said and done. I have it now at about 12 million in directly confirmed, either because the victims themselves have confirmed those exactly, or because confirmed victims' funds were co-spent into the same attacker address. So it is still rising. Victims are still coming forth. The nature of this attack is very different than other crypto attacks. Without victim reports, we cannot find all of the attackers, right? The funds are not flowing from one centralized point and then we have to trace them downstream. We also have to trace upstream because the funds are sitting, across many distributed wallets that have never interacted with each other yet.
Alex, you've been in this industry for pretty much your entire career, and you've seen a lot. You've seen, the Mt. Gox hack, for example. You've seen the fallout from SBF and FGX. You've seen the approval of spot Bitcoin ETFs. You've seen what the Trump administration has done with Bitcoin and with digital currencies. Where does this particular hack or this particular instance sort of fit within the context of the life of Bitcoin?
Well, it's particularly devastating, like I said, because of the cultural demographic of those who are affected here. You take Mt. Gox or FTX as examples, Tim, like those at least still tragic, but at least those were people who knowingly sent their funds to the third party, right? Again, these people who lose money in their Coldcard self-custody wallets largely are not speculating. They are working hard every day, buying Bitcoin over time. The average dormancy of coins that was stolen is about 4 years, right? They didn't just buy it and do something risky. The median loss here among reported victims is 1 Bitcoin. And many of those people are telling us it's their life savings. So I don't know exactly where it fits. It's a tough question in the never-ending saga of Bitcoin and blockchains, but it is a particularly unique blow to the core of the philosophy because it involves secure self-custody and self-storage. And I know you're talking to the guy from Ledger later. This does not affect
in a minute.
Yeah, this vulnerability does not affect all hardware wallets, by any means. It is specific and isolated here, but I think just the nature of it has the Bitcoin community reeling, and it will damage the near and medium term argument and narrative for self-custody.
Yeah, I'm sure Ian is going to make that point with us with regard to Ledger. Alex, you got me thinking about this sort of existential question about Bitcoin and whether it really goes at the narrative around this. You said, at least in the short and medium term, people are going to be reeling, but is there long-term damage from this that turns people off to it?
I think it's going to survive. Bitcoin has such a compelling story for those that believe in it. I actually think the long-term impact will largely be positive. You have developers coming together from across the ecosystem, utilizing the most modern AI technologies to red team Bitcoin open source software at scale. I think some lessons have been learned here about, Bitcoiners like to say often, don't trust, verify. I think it's very clear that not enough verification was being done, and that's being like forcefully corrected here at scale. So I think you'll get better education out of Bitcoin influencers about how to self-custody safely. I think you'll see Bitcoin community be less judgmental against those who choose not to self-custody, and they won't be derided as not being pure enough in the Bitcoin philosophy. And I think you'll see a substantially increased amount of money and effort spent to evaluate code bases for vulnerabilities.
You've been able to follow some of this Bitcoin on-chain. How much of this can be realistically recovered or frozen once attackers start moving it off-chain and maybe to other services?
Yeah, that is a tough question. It is hard to follow because of the disparate nature of self-custody storage. I would say, by our count, about 90% of the stolen funds are currently sitting inert, unmoved from attacker addresses on chain. Some has started to trickle, especially from later waves of attacks, into things like bridges and exchanges, where it gets a lot harder to track. In terms of the percentage chance of recovery, we don't quite know. I would say it is probably pretty low, but there have been many instances where Bitcoin was stolen and sat for a long time unmoved, even 5 years. If you think about the Bitfinex hack, sat for like 5+ years before eventually being recovered almost in full. That's the effort that we're undertaking, is to widely propagate the attacker on-chain addresses to centralized intermediaries like brokerages and crypto exchanges, federal law enforcement, so that if the funds ever do flow to a centralized point, they can be frozen and hopefully recovered for the victims.
And we do appreciate you pointing out the fact, Alex, that this isn't it's not widespread, it's not everyone being affected. But I'm curious, when do you think, at what point do we stop calling this a hardware wallet exploit and start calling it maybe a systemic failure in the way people view self-custody in the Bitcoin world?
I don't think you're going to get there. I mean, it's a reasonable question, though. You're not the only one asking it, Isabelle. This, again, not just because this was a hardware wallet vulnerability generally, but this company, Coinkite, was widely thought to be one of the most secure in sort of the deepest pockets of Bitcoin culture. So I think you really need to see Bitcoin culture evolve here and account for the risk that people took when they didn't think they were taking any. So it's honestly, it's too early to tell, but I don't think this is a Bitcoin vulnerability at its core. I think the price of Bitcoin over the event, I mean, last week throughout the event, Bitcoin was rising. You had strategy selling and this Coldcard attack, and Bitcoin rose modestly last week. Even today, it's holding in the same sort of unmoved range. It's the tragedy of the people, I think, and the damage to the core philosophy that is most notable. 112 million. It's not that big of a blast radius as far as the market's concerned. And when we talk to institutional investors, people are concerned and upset to hear about it, but almost none of them are affected.